Chapter 2, Section 4. Johnny lay in the birth and death room. This was hardly more than a closet with a tiny window off the kitchen, used for storage except in times of sickness. His hand had been done up in a linseed poultice. The smell of the linseed was stifling, and now, on the second day, the pain had really begun. His arm throbbed all the way up to the shoulder. Gran Hopper was in the kitchen, talking to Mrs. Lapham.
Mind you keep that poultice wet. Just leave it wrapped up and wet it now and then with lime water. There's more luck than anything else in things like this. If it don't come along good, I'll make a charm.
Not many years before Gran Hopper would have been hanged for a witch. She had the traditional venerable years, the toothless cackle, the mustache, nor was she above resorting to charms. She had had vast experience. No doctor in Boston knew more than she about midwifery and children's diseases. So far, she had done as well as any of them, except for one thing. The hand had been allowed to draw together, turn in on itself. It was less painful than if it had been held out flat. By the fourth day, ulceration had set in. This was considered nature's way of healing an injury. Gran Hopper gave him laudanum and more laudanum. There followed drowsy days and nights that ran together, a ceaseless roaring in the ears. There was nothing left of him but the pain and the drug. The fever abated, and with it the doses of the drug. Johnny had not once looked at his hand since he had stood before the furnace and seen it lined with silver. Gran Hopper said on the next day she would unwrap it and see. As she cheerfully put it, what was left? Thus far the pain and the drug and the fever had dulled his mind. He had not thought about the future, for of what use to anyone was a cripple-handed silversmith? But that night Gran Hopper's words haunted him. Next day she would see what was left. He was utterly unprepared for the sight of his hand when finally it was unwrapped and lay in the midwife's aproned lap. Mrs. Lapham, Madge, Dorcas, all had crowded into the little birth and death room. Scylla and Izana were in the kitchen, too frightened to go near him. "My," said Madge, "isn't that funny looking? The top part, Johnny, looks all right, although a little narrow, but Johnny, your thumb and palm have grown together." This was true. He bent and twisted his fingers. He could not get the thumb to meet the forefinger. Such a hand was completely useless. For the first time he faced the fact that his hand was crippled. "Oh, let me see!" Dorcas was leaning over him. She gave her most elegant little screech of horror, just like a great lady who has seen a mouse. "My," said Mrs. Lapham, "that's worse than anything I had imagined. Now, isn't that a shame? Bright boy like Johnny just ruined. No more good than a horse with sprung knees." Johnny did not stay to hear more. That morning he had dressed, with Mrs. Lapham's competent help, for the first time. He got up, stood facing them stiffly, his bad hand jammed into his breeches pocket. "I'm going out," he said thickly. Scylla and Izana sat close together in a frightened huddle, staring at him, not daring to speak. Then he said rudely, "You should have come in too and seen the fun." Scylla gaped at him, tried to say something. She only swallowed. "You two sitting there, looking like a couple of fishes." He slammed the front door after him. He had always been bad about slamming doors. In the fresh air he felt better. He pretended not to hear Mrs. Lapham calling him from a window to come right back. All of Fish Street could hear when Mrs. Lapham called. He paid no heed. He walked all over Boston, his hand thrust deep in his breeches pocket. Instinctively, he wanted to tire himself out, which was easy in his weakened condition, so he could not think. When he came back, there was something queer about the silence of the kitchen. No one reproved him because he had disobeyed Mrs. Lapham. He knew they had been talking about him. Scylla, for one of the first times in her life, tried to be polite to him. "Oh, Johnny," she whispered, "I'm sorrier than I ever was before." Izana said, "Is it true, like Ma says? You'll be only good for picking rags?" Scylla turned on Izana. "You're crazy. Johnny isn't going to pick rags." "But oh, Johnny, it's so awful. And I'm so sorry, and—" Johnny's face was crimson. "Will you stop talking about it?" Izana went on. "Madge says it looks awful." "If either of you girls," he stormed, "ever mention that I've even got a hand, I'll just get on a ship and never come back. I'm not going to have you mucking about with your infernal crybaby, oh, how dreadfuls." So he went to the shop. He saw with anger that Dove was sitting at his bench, daring to use his tools. He had not been in the shop for a month. Of course, it should be expected that Dove would use his bench for a little while, just until he was back at it himself. Mr. Lapham had looked up from his work, blinked gently, shook his head, and sighed. Dusty was making a terrific din in one corner. Johnny stood and watched Dove's clumsy work as long as he could in silence. At last he burst out, "Dove, don't hold your crimping iron like that." Dove leaned back. His fat, white face grinned up at him with exaggerated innocence. "Thank you, Master Johnny. I know I'm not as good as you are. Won't you please to show me just how I should hold my crimping iron?" Johnny walked out of the shop by the door leading to the wharf. He'd never show anybody again how to hold a crimping iron. "If you can't do, you had best shut up." He started to slam the door, thought better of it. "If you can't do, you'd best not slam doors." So he strolled the length of the wharf. There was a big ship in from Jamaica. He idly watched porters rolling barrels of molasses out of its hold. A sailor was trying to sell an old lady a parrot. He saw John Hancock standing in a group of men. The sugar basin had never been delivered. When Mr. Lapham had discovered the evil that had gone on in his absence, and the terrible punishment God had meted out to Johnny Tremain, he had ordered the whole thing melted down, and he himself had gone over to Mr. Hancock, returned the cream pitcher, and merely said he had found it impossible to make a sugar basin. No explanation. The boy was accustomed to working from 8 to 12, sometimes 14 hours in a day. He had no holidays, no Saturday afternoons. He had often imagined to himself the pleasure it would be just to stroll once down to Hancock's wharf, as he was strolling now. Nothing to do. His hands in his pockets. Other boys, friends of his, would look up from their work, envy his idleness. Here and there he did see a familiar face. He believed every one of them was talking about his burn, pitying him. There was not a boy on the wharf Johnny did not know. He had made friends with some and enemies of others, and had played or fought with all of them. He saw Saul and Dicer packing salt herrings in a tub, Andy, his leather thimble strapped to his palm, sewing a sail, Tom Drinker, the local bully, coopering a barrel. This was Johnny's world, but now he walked through it an alien. They knew what had happened. They did not envy Johnny's idleness. He saw one nudge another. They were whispering about him, daring to pity him. Dicer's master, the herring pickler, yelled some kind remark to him, but Johnny did not answer. Seemingly, in 1 month, he had become a stranger, an outcast on Hancock's wharf. He was maimed, and they were whole. At the end of the wharf, under the derrick used for unloading the largest ships, he stripped off his clothes and dove into the water. There was not another working boy in Boston who was out swimming in the middle of the afternoon. Only once or twice in a summer, on days of unendurable heat, teachers dismissed school, masters closed shops, and the boys ran down to the wharves to swim. Sometimes, like Mr. Lapham's boys, They swam secretly, silently, on Sunday afternoons, but usually only after dusk had fallen and the day's work was over. Johnny dove and swam. Johnny dove and swam. But it was curious to be alone. He did not like the feeling of being thus cut off from his normal life. Yet one thing gave him great pleasure. Once in the water, his bad hand was as good as the other. Swimming, he could forget it.